Hi, this is Kathy from GadgetStop321, and in today's video I'm going to be taking a look at Iroshizuku Shin-kai. I'll do a writing sample on 52 GSM Tomoe River paper using a variety of pens and nib sizes. I'll take a look at writing samples that I did earlier on copy paper and rhodia. I'll compare Iroshizuku Shin-kai to similar inks from my collection. And finally, I'll take a look at the results of my water resistance test. Iroshizuku Shin-kai looks brighter on my camera than it does in real life. It's more of a blue-gray than the dark bright blue that you're seeing here. Shin-kai goes down nice and uniformly when writing with a glass dip pen. It shades gradually from dark to a medium blue-gray. The drip at the end of the swatch has a little bit of a halo of pink sheen, and that pink sheen shows up in areas where the ink goes down a little more heavily, like at the end, like at the beginning and the end of this scribble that I made with the dip pen. I'm going to begin my writing sample with a Pilot Kakuno. It has an extra fine stainless steel nib. Pretty dry. I'm not sure if the ink is just soaking into the paper pretty quickly or if it's just that little amount of ink being put down by this nib, but the writing experience was very smooth, especially for an extra fine nib. I didn't have to write with a heavy hand. I was able to write very lightly, and this ink is dark enough to be very legible. I'm going to go ahead and put, for an extra fine nib, this was smooth. And the hard start there at the beginning is just because I dip these in ink. I don't have a converter that this is inked up with, and it's been a little longer than normal between me dipping the pen and actually doing this writing sample. In fact, it's been most of the day. These pens were dipped earlier this morning, and it's late in the evening right now that I'm doing these writing samples. Next, I've got a Pilot Grants. It has a 14 karat fine nib. I prefer using this Gold Grants nib on rhodia paper. I prefer the rhodia paper over this Tomoe River paper, not because of any of the properties of the paper, just because on my rhodia paper the grids are a little bit larger. This is a bit wetter than my steel nibs, than this extra fine steel nib, and where I really enjoy this steel nib on these smaller grids in this Hobonichi, I think these are 4mm grids. This is wet enough that I just prefer writing it a little bit larger, but it's very smooth on this Tomoe River paper. In fact, if I were using this pen to write in this notebook, I would probably use 2 lines or 2 grids per line of writing, but it was very pleasant. Next, I've got a Sailor LeCool. It has a medium fine stainless steel nib. Now the writing is very similar between this LeCool and the Pilot Grants. I should say they look very similar, but you can see it's quite a bit drier. This ink is dark enough that the legibility of it isn't affected too much by how wet the nib is. I actually preferred this Sailor LeCool on these more narrow lines. It's drier. It's just enough drier that it doesn't feel as sloppy when writing with it, and it was very pleasant. I'm going to put nice because I wouldn't call it, well, I could have put that this was smooth. I can feel the feedback, but it's not enough that it's unpleasant. I just feel like I have some nice control. Let me see, this is a bit smoother. I am going to go ahead and put that this felt a bit smoother, and I think it's just because it's wetter, so the nib is kind of slipping on that ink a little bit more. Next, I've got a Sailor 1911. It has a 14 karat hard medium nib. This is very nice. I've really enjoyed the writing samples that I did with this Sailor 1911. I think the color of this ink, this blue-gray with this cream-colored pen, I get a vintagey feel when I'm writing with this. Now, you can see that this medium nib is decently wet, kind of like the Grant's was, so I would probably prefer writing a bit larger than I am right here, but the writing experience with this nib, you feel the feedback. Actually, you hear the feedback. Writing with this nib, you get a lot of that scritchy, scratchy sound, and I just love the sound of it. I'm going to put, it was pretty smooth. I'm going to put nice exclamation point. This is one of my favorite nibs to write with this ink. Next, I've got a Pilot Metropolitan. It has a stainless steel calligraphy medium nib. The hard start there again is because this nib has been dipped and set for a while. This stainless steel nib, like the steel nib on the LaCool and the Kakuno, is drier than the gold nibs, and the writing is a bit lighter when you compare it to the Sailor 1911, but not significantly lighter. It was very pleasant. A lot of times with inks that have a shading property to it, this pen and nib, or this nib, will feel too dry, but this was very nice. And it looks good. Next, I've got a Pilot Lucina. It has a stainless steel broad nib. Okay, finally a stainless steel nib that's pretty wet, and this was, as a result of that, very smooth on this paper. I want to do a quick writing sample with the reverse. This nib tends to write very well in reverse. Very smooth, quite a bit drier. Looks quite a bit like the Kakuno Extra Fine. Very nice. And finally, I've got a Howe X750. It has a stainless steel 1.5 stub nib. Not as wet as I was expecting. This was just glassy smooth. While that dries, I'll take a look at some of these other writing samples. The writing samples that I did on Rhodia were not excessively smooth, but they were all very nice. The smoothest was the 1.5 stub, but even it had a velvety feel to it, where it wasn't just glassy smooth. You felt like you had a little bit of control. Surprisingly, the Pilot Lucina had kind of a chalky feel to it that was very pleasant, again, that gave me some control. The Pilot Metropolitan felt nice, and even though it was pretty dry and is a bit more pale than some of the other writing samples, it felt very nice, and it looks pretty decent. The Sailor 1911 Standard had that audible feedback. I loved it. It felt very nice. The Sailor LeCool, I put nice. I probably would have enjoyed it even more if I had not have written with the 1911 first. It was so fantastic that it just made the LeCool and the Grants just felt kind of average. And when I wrote with the Kakuno, I was kind of surprised by how smooth it was. I put that it was nice, but if you compare it to other extra fine nibs, it was really smooth. On copy paper, I was kind of surprised that this broad 1.5 stub felt as pleasant as it did. I was expecting it to feel a little wet, but it wasn't very wet. I think it's because it was soaking into the paper pretty quickly. If you look at the opposite side, there was a little bit of bleed through. This is pretty thick copy paper. It's not my normal 20-pound that everything bleeds through, but we had some spots where it bled through. But that 1.5 stub nib was pretty pleasant to write with. In fact, I liked it more than the Lucina Broad. It just felt a little too wet. I think you could feel the ink spreading, and that's kind of a unpleasant, at least for me, whenever I'm using a fountain pen. The Lucina and the Metro look very similar in their legibility, but the Metropolitan felt much better because it's not as wet. The 1911 was nice, but the feedback was more noticeable. And the Sailor LeCool had a similar amount of feedback, but I think it was more noticeable because the nib is more narrow and it's starting to border on unpleasant, but it was okay. The Grants was just way too wet. When I was writing, I could feel the wetness of the paper. It felt like I was writing on a wet piece of paper. It wasn't that pleasant. So when I wrote with the Kakuno, it just felt great, especially since I had just written with that unpleasant Grants. So my favorites were, for writing on copy paper, I think the Pilot steel nibs, like the calligraphy medium and maybe a fine or extra fine, are very pleasant on this copy paper. Now, the first time I wrote with Shin-kai was using my sister's Homo sapiens that has it has a medium CSI grind, a cursive stub italic, and it was very pleasant. And so when I wrote with this one the first time, when I started doing these writing samples, it came out of the nib kind of a dark blue with some brightness to it, but very quickly dried to kind of a dark gray blue. Now, when it first comes out of the nib, it looks more like Oxford blue. Oxford blue is dark, but it has a bit of brightness to it, but when it dries, it looks a bit different. In fact, it looks a little more like Diatramentus Sherlock Holmes. Sherlock Holmes is still a little bit bluer. I'm seeing a bit more gray in Shin-kai, but they're very similar. They behave somewhat similarly. Now, 54th Massachusetts is kind of that gray blue, but it behaves very differently. It feathers more, and it's not one of my favorites. To me, it's an ink that you have to use in a very, very fine nib, and I guess on very good paper. Mysterious Blue is similar. It's a bit lighter. It's more like the lighter shades. Kick You also is a bit similar. Kick You has just a hint of teal to it. You don't really notice it until you look at it compared to an ink that doesn't have that teal component. And Roaring Klinger Verdigris has just a hint of teal to it when you compare it to Shin-kai, but it is more like the darker shades. You don't get as much of this light when you're writing with Verdigris. When I did my water resistance test, I was kind of surprised that I didn't see any black or gray left behind. It just looks like all blue, which kind of surprises me because it looks bluish gray after it dries. It's legible after I dipped this in water for 10 minutes, and it's legible, but it does smear the ink. Okay, the writing sample that I did on Tomoe River paper, there's a little bit of show through because it's a darker ink, but on the areas where ink was put down more heavily in the swatch and the writing with the dip pen, there's absolutely no bleed through, and it didn't even get very deep into the paper. I'm not seeing much sheen in the writing except for the Pilot Lucina. I'm seeing sheen and some shading, and on this stub nib I'm seeing both sheen and shading. On the Grants, it's wet enough that I'm seeing just little bits of sheen. This is a very pleasant ink to use, even in my wider nibs. Typically, a dark blue like this, I don't enjoy it in the wider nibs. I like it in the finer gold nibs especially, but this even had character in the broad and stub nibs. Very pleasant. Now, I was able to get one of these little 15 ml bottles. These are my favorites. I tend to use finer nibs, and so these 15 ml bottles last me quite a while. It's getting harder, though, to find these small bottles, especially individually. Most of my samples came in 3-packs, and this one came with another bottle of Yamabudo, which is fine. I'm going through Yamabudo pretty quickly right now, and I think it came with another bottle of maybe Asagao, either Asagao or Konpeki. Either way, it came with inks that I will use them with. You used to be able to get these inks individually, like at Jet Pens, but I've noticed now Jet Pens sells these in 3-bottle sets, but it's 3 of the same bottle of ink. So to me, that's not as useful. So I don't know, it's getting harder to get these little small bottles. Alright, if you found this video helpful, please give me a thumbs up, and if you'd like to see more videos like this, please subscribe to my channel.